So part two, our discussion of Invisible Man, remakes versus originals. One of the powers that I think we fantasize about is the power of invisibility. So we see the realities and the dark sides of that fantasy. We'll be discussing the Halloway movie in 2000 by Paul Verhoeven, and the 1982 version of the Memoirs of Invisible Man by John Carpenter. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmond.
Hi there.
And I was wondering if you've had that kind of fantasy, or like if you had a power or superpower, what would it be? Would it be invisibility?
I don't know. If I had a superpower, it would probably be time travel. That would be by far the most. You could just obviously manipulate all sorts of things or you could do it for your own benefit or for the benefits of other people. I guess that I've never really, invisibility, I suppose maybe when I was a teenager, perhaps. But no, aside from that, not really.
Yeah, I had the same kind of feeling that it seems like a fun kind of let's call it superpower, but probably gets pretty tiresome after a bit and stuff. And so flying was always mine, which of course is partially why I went into aviation and stuff. So
right. Yeah, you could get creative with it. You could sort of say, you could maybe have the power to, I don't know, spread psychedelic spores through the air or something like that, and impact people's states of mind or something like that. It's a bit like the in the Captain Britain comic by oh man, I can't remember his name now. Alan Moore. There we go. And that was kind of like the Mad Hatter's superpower in that one. That was quite interesting. But
so speaking of kind of the fantasy of it and the realities of it, the John Carpenter version definitely I feel like kind of covers that. It's interesting that that's actually, it feels like a lot of the focus of this one with Chevy Chase and stuff, playing Nick Halloway, who he's kind of this well, lack of a better way to put it, a bit of a douche and stuff like that, until like all of a sudden he cowered his blessing and curse that definitely he realizes too quickly that it's not as fun as it seems and stuff.
Yeah, he's sort of I guess sort of a relic of the 80s yuppie kind of culture.
Definitely.
And he's single, successful, but sort of hasn't really found anybody specific to shack up with, and meets the love of his life in this chance sort of drinking session. So it's kind of this idea, I guess, of he has a very superficial life, and then all the sort of superficial things get taken away from him by him becoming invisible. I guess it's sort of a slight little critique of 80s superficiality and materialism, I would say. So he loses all the superficial stuff, but finds true love. It's kind of a very sentimental 80s, 90s sort of style movie in that respect.
I feel like this is very atypical of John Carpenter movies, and there's, I guess, a few different reasons for that. I think the closest thing that we see with that he makes is maybe like They Live, kind of, or possibly, I guess, the Manchurian Candidate, which we'll be talking about at some point. That it's like a bit of more of a thriller, like we have all these kind of the government kind of after Nick and wanting to get back their I feel like it's almost like a popular theme in the 80s of like, if you get some kind of power or some kind of ability, or if you're an alien and stuff like that, then next thing you know, the black vans, the government's going to be after you and stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. It was kind of, that was definitely the 70s was a much more sort of freer from a moral perspective in terms of movie making, in that you never really quite knew what was going to happen at the end of a 70s movie. In the 80s movie, it would be more or less a kind of straight down the line, moral kind of by the numbers story with maybe interesting characters, but generally likable characters. And then, there would invariably be the government coming in as like the sort of bad guys in some capacity. And that happens in a lot of big blockbuster movies in the 80s, actually.
Yeah, like one really comes to mind, of course, is War Games. And it seemed like just basically this idea that like if you do something too exceptional, like kind of they're going to come after you and stuff, like, so don't be too exceptional.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot, isn't there? It's like E.T.
Yep.
I guess even Close Encounters, a lot of Spielberg movies played on that idea.
Right.
Short Circuit has it as well. It's always the government or the government contractor coming in and trying to sort of stop some sort of technological or some exceptional kind of person to some degree, or an alien, or something out of the ordinary.
And I think partially this was like a more of a vanity piece for Chevy Chase. He was kind of hitting his stride a bit. Like there's a little bit more of a heyday around that time period. Like he made of course, like movies like Caddyshack, National Vacation and stuff like that, or National Lampoon's Vacation. And I think he was like looking for something that kind of just basically kind of showcase them more, something other than like a Griswold character.
Terrible mistake, I think, for that. But, it's funny. He's like one of these. Some actors can do it and some can't. But he's like, I kind of want to be. And he actually, I think, his production company was involved in this, and he wanted to tone down the humor because he wanted to be a serious actor,
right?
And that kind of thing. And I mean, I suppose it's not that serious. You get to see him being lonely and a bit of an outsider, which is a kind of a John Carpenter kind of thing, I suppose, if you wanted to draw any parallels to some of his other work. But aside from that, I mean, this originally had a script by Ivan Reitman, and then it got rewritten, and you kind of think, well, actually, it was kind of much more geared towards a comedy. They shouldn't have toned down the comedy, because actually some of the most inventive parts of it are the sort of use of effects to have visual jokes with his invisibility. Those are the very few kind of fun moments in this movie.
Right.
Stories vary by the numbers, and watching Chevy Chase be sort of slightly depressed and lonely is it's just not very
depressing.
Depressing. It's just not very doesn't play to his strengths, really. But you see this with comic actors. Jim Carrey did it, Tom Hanks did it, and it's also sometimes
even Bill Murray too.
Yeah, even Bill Murray. A lot of them go back to it later on, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because sometimes it does work. In the case of Jamie Foxx and stuff, like when he started doing serious roles, I actually liked him more. But it's because I didn't really like him as a comic, though. Like kind of, so that's the ironic part. Like Chevy Chase, I actually really always enjoyed his movies typically, and I look forward to those roles where he's kind of playing those characters like Fletch and stuff like that. That where he's kind of this charismatic and fun, kind of charming, character stuff. But then when he's kind of like in these more contemplative kind of, serious roles, stuff like that, that's something. It's the thing we've talked about before, that like different times we have a shorthand as an audience that and something we want, expectation that we want of these actors in these roles. And then when they're not playing that, they're playing off that. It's it may or may not work and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I watched a recent sort of podcast with Quentin Tarantino and Joe Rogan, where he sort of says that the difference between sort of Chevy Chase and Bill Murray is that they're both very similar characters for the first hour, sort of slightly, disillusioned, cocky, but very funny kind of guys who aren't massively likable, but they're funny. And then Bill Murray's movies, he has this kind of epiphany phase in the last 20 minutes where it becomes like a magical sort of sentimental moralist. But Chevy Chase doesn't generally do that. He tends to stay quite, it sort of plays it out by the end. And actually, it's more just the plot of what's happening that actually carries you along, rather than you all of a sudden liking this character or having him have a transformative moment. And I think that was kind of what was sort of slightly disappointing about this, because you kind of, if you're used to Chevy Chase in that kind of role, you kind of wanted to see him in this, and you just wanted it to be funnier. You didn't really need to have him, fall in love or have some sort of massive change of heart or anything like that.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that's a really great point. That there is those transformation, and which may be why I feel like between the two, Bill Murray is probably the one that we generally enjoy more. We want somebody who has a transformation, and so we've come to expect that with him. And whereas Chevy Chase, we have this expectation that he doesn't really change and stuff, and we actually like it that way with him.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I think he's very aware of that as well, because after this movie, I mean, he kind of fell off the map a little bit. He really didn't. I didn't see much of him until Community.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
And he's become a very kind of, whereas he's quite sort of I don't know, extrovert and in your face in a lot of the 80s movies, he now seems much more withdrawn in Community, or is just his general persona as a celebrity. It's almost like he's kind of very kind of standoffish now. And Bill Murray went on a completely different sort of avenue, in that he seemed to get involved in much more quirky and experimental sort of things. And I think that's what's made people kind of gravitate towards him and giving him more work as well, perhaps. But yeah, I mean, I was quite pretty impressed with the effects in this movie.
Oh yeah,
its age, it was pretty well done. Apparently, it was one of the earliest uses of CGI, and it took them 9 months or something of preparation to actually make the movie. So I mean, it was pretty decently done. Daryl Hannah was a bit, I don't know, a bit nothingy in it, really. Sort of a love interest that was fairly by the numbers. But yeah, it's, Sam Neill's a fairly sort of meanish bad guy, but he's fairly one-dimensional. I mean, I would say that's the problem, is that, they bring a bit of the sort of standard stereotypical characters, but there isn't really anything exceptional about Chevy Chase's character to really get you to, follow this movie closely. I mean, I'd be bored of it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and the other thing I thought was interesting, though, that San Francisco itself, though, was again kind of like its own character in this, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And ironically, it was mostly filmed in Washington D.C., which I didn't realize. Like they did so much of they played up so much of the Bay Area kind of thing is like that. So that was like the kind of the typical Hollywood smoke and mirrors, I guess, and stuff.
Yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some nice visual gags of him sort of running along in the beach with just the sort of the top and the shorts and nothing else, kind of running along, and the footprints in the sand and stuff. It's pretty cool. But yeah. Aside from that, it's some nice effects. It's kind of reasonable, kind of light-hearted watch. I mean, I guess the main difference between this version, if we had to, and all the other versions of The Invisible Man, is that he, as the Invisible Man, is not directly involved with any of the science. So there is, they do make room for you to feel sorry for the character and identify with him, because he's invisible as an accident, rather than having a god complex or being a maniacal scientist or something like this. So it's interesting from that perspective.
And one of the more interesting kind of lines, though, was I never realized how important it is to be seen. So I thought that was a really interesting comment. That like different times, and maybe in some ways that was the other aspect of like we talked about how he's an example of like kind of that time period. He's like the power broker douche, kind of stuff like that. But behind it all, he was like kind of like really just not so visible and stuff like that. He was just a guy that could have disappeared and really not like people wouldn't really miss him. If anything, they would have just talked more behind his back and stuff.
Yeah, they made a big point of that, didn't they? That this person lived a very superficial life, because he finds out from all of his friends that they don't particularly like him, and they don't even really care that he's died. Actually, that is the story when he's in the beach house. So I guess it's kind of this fairly social comment that if you chase all these material things and you don't have real friendships or relationships, you essentially become invisible, perhaps. Something. Did you actually enjoy it?
I thought it was it was better than I thought it'd be, because I kind of had the impression that it was like kind of just really just awful movie, something like that, and I found that like just the little kind of moments where it's kind of like just reflecting on like kind of how it would be to be invisible, stuff like that. And I thought it was interesting how at different times we would see his character, like actually still in the scene, and people just would not see him. Like they didn't use that. I don't think they've used that for any other movie, and that's a kind of interesting gimmick, I thought.
Yeah, that's a big difference actually with all the other ones we've watched, in that you'd have the same scene, you'd see it without him, and then you'd be the only one seeing him. So it was kind of a cinematic effect, I felt, that made the idea was to get the viewer to identify solely much more with him as a character, but it still didn't really work, unfortunately. I mean, my problem was I had very low expectations going into it, and then I was watching the credits roll and I saw John Carpenter, so immediately my expectations went like this, and I was like, oh, it's a Carpenter movie, how stupid.
Right.
I was just like, right, this is obviously the one John Carpenter movie that I don't like. I mean, and he didn't do the soundtrack for it, and that was probably the real, I was really hoping he should have just gone for the synth, about scoring it properly, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing to mention is that apparently that like he was kind of on the hook to, for some kind of contract to do, X number of movies and stuff. So this was like the one-off to kind of fulfill his obligation and everything.
Right.
So it's kind of like you said, it's very pretty by the numbers for a lot of it, and I think that's really it. He just like, I was watching a clip of him, kind of the behind the scenes, and he kind of was there, but he kind of like looked like he was just there, like he was professional, but it was like it didn't seem like he was kind of like particularly really like engrossed in being there, something like that.
I mean, the great thing about being John Carpenter in 1992 is that you've already had 10 years of making amazing movies, basically.
Right.
Classics. So it's quite nice when you can just sort of, check out on something that you're probably getting paid an enormous amount of money for. But yeah. So any further thoughts on Memoirs of an Invisible Man, or should we move on to Hollow Man?
Yeah, I mean, overall, there wasn't really much that was striking about it, besides kind of like you said, some of the effects and stuff like that, and just the exceptions to things that we talked about. So I'd say, yeah, let's kind of go on to another movie by another remake by somebody who we talked about several times, with RoboCop, Total Recall, Showgirls, Paul Verhoeven, and it's kind of like also like a movie that is. I don't know. In some ways, it is kind of like his body of work, but in other ways, it's kind of a one-off as well.
Yeah, it's funny because there's a quote from Elizabeth Shue's character where she says, "The concept of Kane is much more interesting than the person," and that's kind of how I feel about this movie. The concepts in this movie are far more interesting than action, in a way.
I did feel that way as well.
I mean, there's an interesting. I mean, one thing that got me is the title, Hollow Man, which I think sort of references T.S. Eliot's poem, which is called Hollow Men. And the quotes that sort of stuck out for me from that are, these men are bodies without definition, shadows without color, frozen strength, action without movement. And then when hollow men are walking alone and filled with love, instead of kissing someone, they say prayers to broken stone statues. So this is idea of sort of people forgetting their sort of humanity. And of course, the most famous quote from that poem is, "This is how the world ends. The speaker says 3 times in a row, not with a loud burst, but with a quiet whimper." So obviously I think he was reading quite a lot of T.S. Eliot when he decided to make this movie. But this was actually much better than I expected it to be, much better than I remembered it to be. It takes, I mean, like the 1930s version, which is about this idea of the lack of accountability when there's no one there watching you, and the power that goes along with that. Right. This one takes, in my opinion, a much more sort of interesting approach to that, in that it sort of brings gender into the equation as well as sort of modern things but I think even cinema methods and various other things. I mean, the first thing we see in it is an animal that's invisible basically sort of killing another animal immediately. So it's almost like right from the get-go he's saying, when you're not accountable and you're invisible, well, all the worst and animal instincts can wreak havoc on the world.
Right.
So yeah, that was, and I mean, it's funny because there's you could superficially read this as, again, the mad scientist kind of playing God, but they even make fun of that, and I think that's really not the point of this movie. Is I think that's really not what he's going for here. I think it's kind of, you've got to remember Paul Verhoeven studied sort of religion, so there's a very big, the moral messages are much more in your face, I would say, in this one. What were your initial sort of impressions of it?
Yeah, I did feel like kind of, here's a scientist, kind of playing God and stuff. I did feel like that was like kind of, one of the things. And there was also like, I would compare it a lot to the Icarus story as well, that, like where you kind of go a little too far, like kind of, that like, which is as we've talked about before, a theme that we see a lot in sci-fi, like kind of the one that kind of really, strikes the most is probably, like The Fly and stuff like that, where, you just push science a little too much to its boundaries and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, he does refer to himself as God repeatedly in the, and he's, I mean, it's kind of, there's a quote initially that says, amazing what you can do when you don't have to look at yourself in the mirror. And, I think some of this is that the point he's getting across there is that we tend to think we have this intrinsic kind of moral code, but it's really the ability of being held accountable and people seeing your actions that society holds you sort of morally accountable for your behavior. And this, I mean, he's very much a kind of a sociopath, psychopath character. Yeah. And as we sort of talked about before, his lack of connection to any kind of, his complete cutoff from any kind of mimetic behavior in society brings out the animal sort of in him, essentially. So yeah, and of course Paul Verhoeven seems to do this quite a lot in his movies, but the first thing he does is rape a woman. This is like a complete expression of male power, exacerbated, complete right from the get-go.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, he's pretty ruthless right from the, and very quickly cements this idea that, right, basically all morality has gone out the window. And I thought this was interesting as it kind of, the 2020 version kind of expands on this, in that it kind of shows that a lack of accountability is where we see these sort of this male, alpha male sort of power figure in that one, kind of trying to dominate someone.
The megalomania.
It's not quite so sort of, he's not so much sort of dominating over one particular person, which is the 2020 version. This one, he's just kind of generally just doesn't care about anyone and just after his own sort of ambitions. So
definitely. Yeah, I mean, we talked about this idea about the fantasy, the team fantasy of like kind of being visible, right? Where, I mean, I think just everybody, like kind of the thought is that like, okay, if I'm visible, then I can go into the girls' locker room, they couldn't see me, stuff like that. So going to the extreme of that is this expression, like you said, of like kind of where basically he's not only sneaking into the woman's room, but he's raping her and stuff. And so it's like kind of that, like, oh, I've had this power, like kind of, just seeing her naked isn't going to be enough. Like kind of, I mean, I'm going to just basically just just take advantage of her. She's not even going to know what happened stuff.
What's especially sort of twisted about that scene is that you see it from his point of view. And then you also see him hanging around to watch her cry after us as well, which is quite, I mean, in a cinematic sense, he's trying to show the implications, but you don't know if it's actually him who's present in that, or, or is this just us watching the after effects? And that brings us back to, like you said, with the locker room, why is it the invisible man? Why was it a man was chosen for this sort of initially? And that's because it's kind of, I think, because intrinsically society doesn't require men to be seen to fulfill their purpose or get their, what they need out of life, whereas women are objectified. Society sort of places this demand to some degree on women that they are seen. So that's a very sort of, he's obviously sort of zeroed in on some of that stuff, I think, in Hollow Man. So yeah, it's interesting to see how it kind of plays out with Elizabeth Shue's character, because if you sort of one of the things he says to her is, "What bothers you most? That you don't have a life, or that I do?" Which I think is quite a sort of interesting line, because if you look at it, it's kind of like he's very much a sort of this dominant guy who's very sort of intelligent, he's trying to make a breakthrough on his scientific discovery. He's obviously totally involved in his work and actually physically becomes his work. And, and she's a woman who feels that she's superfluous to him in this relationship. So she leaves him for someone else, because she feels like, he's putting his career in front of her. But then when he actually succeeds in becoming invisible, what actually happens is more of her time becomes involved around him. She actually she spends more of her time thinking about him when he makes that scientific breakthrough. Right. And actually the plot becomes more about her starting to hunt and stalk him when he's actually achieved his goal, which I think is a very interesting kind of comment on men, women relationships and the rest of it.
Definitely. And I guess we should point out that he's kind of like wondering, and as usual spoilers, the person that she's involved with is, kind of basically this beta, right, who's another partner in the lab and everything like that. So that's probably even more frustrating to Kevin Bacon's character, because he's like in his mind the alpha, and so an alpha, right, thinks that like, oh, I should always get the woman and stuff like that, and kind of for beta to do that is like kind of just even more insulting, I guess, in some ways and everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very kind of, we're using very manosphere style terms here of alpha, beta and everything, but for those of you viewers not familiar with it, but I think there is this kind of weird switch halfway through where, ultimately, she becomes like this sort of blood-soaked predator of him towards the end in a way. And but he becomes he almost completely, any sort of semblance of connection to normalcy kind of disappears, I guess, with him as well.
This is also some interesting casting in some of the minor roles. One other one I thought mentioned would be Kim Dickens, who's like the other kind of female doctor who, she's the one in charge of the animals that it's Dr. Sarah Kennedy, who's someone's in charge. We'll actually see her in the remake, I guess, of Footloose and stuff like that, and when we decide to like kind of Friday Night Lights, and she's also just for my own personal kind of fandom, I guess, if you will, she's plays a lead character in the Fear the Walking Dead series and stuff. And what for me is interesting is that like in each one she seems like a very different person, because I only I just happened to just be watching some of these and stuff like that. And then after watching this, I looked it up. I was like, oh, that's her. Like kind of, I didn't make that connection. So I feel like an actor really, there's something about it that like, that there's through some kind of transformation, that because it's not just the physicality, like kind of, different hair or whatever else. But I think it's like, if it's really, if they're giving a real performance that you find believable, they transform themselves, and I feel like she really did that for me anyways, between this movie and then as I mentioned those other ones and stuff.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, definitely mostly revolves around Elizabeth Shue and Kevin Bacon in this, but both of them, great performances in this, really. Kevin completely commits to being an evil guy, and Shue is pretty interesting as
very different from Karate Kid and of course Cobra Kai.
Yeah, much more sort of complicated character, I'd say. the other interesting thing I found, I mean, again, this is another movie. This is kind of the thing with the Invisible Man movies. They often, set for perhaps the 2021, they were pushing the visual effects pretty much every stage. And I would say
Definitely.
this one's actually pretty amazing. And that this whole idea of reconstructing a body from the ground up, from
Yeah,
skeleton nerves to muscle
that was
fibers,
something else.
was really something. And it's one of these sort of things that's very dramatic visually, and makes us painfully aware of our own mortality when you're watching it, because it's a painful process as well they go through being turned invisible. And I mean, and it just really sort of shows you Paul Verhoeven's skill as a director, because I mean, if you've watched the 1930s one, in comparison, filmmaking was generally quite static from scene to scene. This one, even though it's sort of focused around scientists and working in a lab before all of this sort of body construction goes on, is very, very dynamic. You know, the shots are sort of moving around, you're seeing the bodies moving. So he's taken what would be just a bunch of scientists doing a couple of tests and made it visually about as dynamic as you possibly could. But yeah, that whole scene is really sort of powerful.
Definitely.
And it's kind of, it makes you sort of wonder as well, this painful transformation, is this maybe, I guess, an idea of, you could say, is this maybe an analogy for being isolated from society, that, you know, that's also potentially painful, I guess. But yeah.
And I think that, you know, one of the things that we typically see, and what's interesting is, I think for Kevin Bacon's character is, even though that he's the main, you know, character, so to speak, you know, he's the Hollow Man, he's also more like a villain, more so than a hero, you know, like kind of, and one of the typical kind of things we see in villains is that they always have some kind of Achilles heel, and for him, it's clearly the ambition, which is like kind of on the one hand what got him there, but the other, it's like kind of, you know, definitely leads to his downfall and stuff.
Yes, because he really values his freedom and doesn't want to be sort of locked up. That's what most of the, and that's probably where the movie gets dull, actually, in my opinion, is where he's just trying to be, you know, he's just trying to escape and just trying to hang out. It's kind of, you feel like there's the whole, his transition to becoming invisible and realizing it and doing a few horrible things. And then there's the last third where it's kind of the action sequence where they're trying to hunt him down. But then in between, it gets a bit slow, to be honest, in my opinion. But you're right. It's kind of, it's basically a sort of almost like a horror movie kind of format in a way, but something kind of different, which is, I guess, why I found it kind of interesting. I sort of had a bit of a, I don't know, realization when I was watching this, and it's maybe sort of quite relevant for a lot of other Verhoeven's movies, is that, you know, there's this kind of paradox of storytelling when you're watching a sci-fi movie, because normally the underlying message is normally some sort of hero's journey, or there's some sort of moral message and things like that. But normally the special effects are so kind of engrossing in a way that they actually give you an excuse not to pay attention to the moral message or the character message. It's kind of this sort of thing of, yeah, I know I should be caring about this person that died, but they got killed in such a cool way. You know, it's kind of, there's this weird sort of stuff that goes on when you're watching this. And I think Starship was another movie a bit like that, in that, you know, you're supposed to be rooting for the heroes, but actually you kind of just want to see them get ripped apart by massive bugs. So it's kind of interesting that, and I think Verhoeven's very kind of conscious of this moral ambiguity with cinema, in that you know, you're kind of we're told that it's there to kind of tell us a nice story, and you're supposed to have learned something in, but actually, you know, half the time you're enjoying the violence or the technical aspects of what's going on in it. So it's kind of interesting in that respect.
I wonder if that's an effect of his religious, you know, background, then, that like he's just bored with like kind of the, you know, moralistic stories, right, which religion typically has, and so he's like kind of just, you know, he just found that he needed an outlet to play with, like you said, the moral ambiguity.
I think it's that, and I think it's also this fact of, it's a satirical sort of component that says, hey, you know, you think you're good people and you're rooting for these good people, but I'm going to make you watch me shoot this guy in the chest 12 times. And that's going to be the image you come away from with this. And you're going to be more shocked by that than you are any of the sort of other messages that are in this movie in a way. And it would be like, you know what, you're coming to watch this movie for that. You're not really watching it for the character story. I think he's very, because there's so many extreme scenes in his movies that sort of make you go, oh, wow. You've got Arnie in Total Recall sort of literally ripping people's arms off and, strangling them and stabbing them in the face and all this kind of stuff. And it's kind of if it wasn't Paul Verhoeven, if it was, say, Steven Spielberg, it would just been a very kind of like regular action movie with a sci-fi kind of theme. But no, he kind of takes it there. So
right. That definitely is one of his trademarks for sure.
Yeah, and I think as well he's very conscious of the voyeuristic sort of element of cinema in that Kane is pretty voyeuristic. He basically tries to steal up any woman he possibly can when he's invisible, or do worse. Which is again a kind of a comment on us. What are we actually going to the cinema?
Right.
In a way. So yeah, and I think it's interesting. He's called Kane.
Right. Oh yeah.
Reference there. So
yeah.
So yeah, but I as I say, I had probably more fun analyzing this movie than I did actually watching it, in all honesty, because it got to get the middle. But still, it's an interesting one. It's one that he hates. Apparently, he disowns it because he says studio, wanted to do them. They made him change lots of stuff, but
yeah. It's in some ways kind of like what he does, but like you said, because of the different things we pointed out. But in other ways, it's also different, and I think it is more like a horror movie. He really doesn't do horror for the most part. So, so I think that's kind of like where it's like almost like a one-off for him.
Yeah, I was reading something about him where he said he doesn't like American movies generally because there's not enough social commentary in them, and it's mostly effects and action and everything else. But he also doesn't entirely like European movies because it's nothing but dialogue and social commentary, and it gets a bit boring. So I think he his films really sort of have this nice kind of interesting
experimentation, I guess, of the two worlds.
Yeah, and I think that was what was, I guess, for someone who actually saw these when they came out for the first time, there was always a feeling that you never quite knew what you were going to get when you watched a Paul Verhoeven movie.
That's true.
So yeah.
Yeah, as a kind of a side note, I've been kind of reading, Rutger Hauer's bio, and I hadn't realized how much he and Verhoeven had a history together. Like some of the breakout roles for Hauer were with, Verhoeven. Unfortunately, or fortunately, like none of them were remakes or anything like that. Knock on wood yet.
Yeah. Wasn't one called Flesh and Blood or something like that? Was the first movie he did with Verhoeven.
Yep. Soldier of Orange was another one, and then Turkish Delight was the first movie that they both kind of collaborated on.
Yeah, I mean, Rutger Hauer is awesome as well. I mean, am I right in thinking that Flesh and Blood is about someone who takes a woman prisoner and then she ends up kind of falling in love with him or something like that? It's kind of Stockholm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Again, sort of relationship. Yeah. So, and did you actually enjoy Hollow Man?
I remember the first time I saw it, I think it might have been in the theaters and stuff. I really walked away going, what did I kind of see, something like that. And then this time around, watching it again, like you said, just breaking down some of the things, definitely, and I feel like that's sometimes another trademark of a Paul Verhoeven movies that if you may walk away kind of not exactly kind of thrilled about what you saw, but it's like when you digest it some more, you kind of appreciate more of kind of the little things that he puts into it.
Yeah, I mean, there was stuff that when I first watched Starship Troopers, I thought, well, this is kind of like a okay-ish kind of sci-fi thing. But it was really just a few things that they really took me off guard, and I just realized later on, oh, those were just really funny,
Right.
you know. And I realized, oh yeah, this is actually a satire. This isn't really a. And then more recently, as we've been watching these, there was that sort of revelation that actually basically all of his films are satires in some degree.
Right.
You know, yeah. This may be the exception to that. But,
Yeah, definitely a lot more action oriented, I guess. Although, kind of, yeah. I mean, you know, what's called fire next to, you know, Starship Troopers, though, just like us, packed to the brim with action and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the funny thing is I watched, you know, I remember when Memoirs came out, I remember when Hollow Man came out. And every time you kind of think, well, there's such scope with the superpower of invisibility. You could literally do anything. And I think whenever you watch an Invisible Man movie, you just think, oh, well, why did he just do X, Y, and Z? He could have done like so much more stuff with Invisible. And that was kind of my overriding impression every time I've come out of a movie where someone develops invisibility.
Right, right. So yeah, I guess we still have yet to see one that kind of you know, pushes things in more interesting directions and stuff. So I'm sure, you know, like kind of just a matter of time before we'll see another remake of some kind.
Definitely, yeah. Who knows? We get Hollow Man remake or something. Yeah. So I guess the question is, what's next up on the roster of originals and remakes?
Yeah, so we've talked about watching the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So we'll definitely have that one coming up. Actually, I thought one that would be particularly interesting at some point will be another Daryl Hannah movie, which is you know, kind of Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. You know, like so that apparently, like you know, it seems like kind of a very schlocky B movie and stuff, which apparently the original, you know, black and white sci-fi was. But then the remake, you know, turns out apparently has, you know, is like one of those that like surprises people and stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay. And of course, we've got the remake of Candyman that's being released.
Yes.
So we can
definitely looking forward to that.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Alrighty. Yeah. So once again, I'm Jen Chang with Dan Benjamins. Thanks for watching, and we.